This week we're going to do lesson 24, country music goes mainstream, lesson 25, hard rock and heavy metal, and then lesson 26, disco. And I'll let you, of course, read those. Take the quizzes for each lesson. Make sure to study before the quizzes, and then make your discussion board post. I also added 2 timelines in the folder for this week, and they are regarding country music. And the reason I did that, you know, our text is a bit out of sync. And that's one way to do it. It's not a bad way, but I think it's confusing sometimes as to how this evolved over time. So I put those timelines in there, and I'd like you to take a look at those timelines, and then after you've looked at them, just send me something that you've noticed about it. Maybe something you discovered that you didn't know before. I don't think it'll take you very long. And also I think you'll find them interesting. One is from PBS, and the other is from the Library of Congress. I also added a link to some information about the Yardbirds. Now the Yardbirds, I've mentioned them before. I think you probably will remember them. I hope. It was a group that actually featured 3 very prominent guitarists, 3 very important rock guitarists. And they were a blues cover band. Their first, their first guitarist, I forgot, he wasn't really well known. But their second guitarist was Eric Clapton. And Eric Clapton played with them. They had a hit. You know, they did mostly blues cover tunes, but then they had a hit of I Ain't Got You, and you can look that up if you want to. But Eric Clapton left them because he felt that they were getting too commercial, possibly. Now, we always have that balance, right, of art and money, and how far are we going to go to make money, and what are we going to do as far as the art? And they were, of course, very much into blues at that time. Eric Clapton was. Later on, it seemed like he did do a lot of pop music, but at that point, he left the band, and that's where he decided to start another group, which was Cream, and that might have been, as we look back, maybe the first supergroup, because it featured some very great virtuosic musicians. I've used that term before, somebody with a tremendous skill on their instrument. Eric Clapton, of course, on guitar and vocals, although he wasn't the main singer. Jack Bruce was on bass and vocals, and Jack Bruce, I think, did a majority of the singing in that group. And Ginger Baker on drums. You may have heard of them. They had some hits. They were on Top 40, Sunshine of Your Love, quite a famous one, but also some other ones that I really liked, White Room and Badge. Those were another 2 hits that they had. And then after Eric Clapton left, the Yardbirds got Jeff Beck. Now Jeff Beck wasn't ever, as far as I know, I don't even know if he had any hits in the top 40, but he was a great guitarist. In fact, some people say that when Eric Clapton left the Yardbirds and got Jeff Beck, no one missed Eric Clapton. But I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what some people say. Jeff Beck, they were all friends, Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck. And the next guitarist that the Yardbirds had was Jimmy Page. And actually, when Eric Clapton left, they wanted to get Jimmy Page, but he was so busy doing studio work that he recommended his friend Jeff Beck. And they hired Jeff Beck. And then after a while, they needed a bass player, so Jimmy Page played bass. And then Jeff Beck left the group, and then Jimmy Page took over on guitar. So those were the 3 guitarists. And of course, Jimmy Page eventually became the guitarist for Led Zeppelin. And that's why this might be important to know. Just a little bit of background, because actually Led Zeppelin came out of the Yardbirds. So I thought you might find that interesting, that little background on Led Zeppelin. Now, as hard rock and heavy metal grew out of the psychedelic era in the 1960s, another style of music which the text does not talk about, maybe because it's not considered enough in the pop music vein, but I also think it's really important. It's one of my favorite types of rock music. I was really interested in it. Of course, I was a teenager at that time, and the type of music that you hear it called now is progressive rock. Sometimes it's called art rock, progressive rock. Now, the influence of progressive rock, part of it was the Beatles. And if you listen to Strawberry Fields Forever, they used an instrument called the mellotron, which had like a string sound. And so a lot of groups used that sound. That was very common in progressive rock groups. Another thing that the Beatles did, at the second side of Abbey Road, all of the songs are connected. It's kind of like more of a classical music idea, that it was not going to be separate songs like they had done before, but one long song that they were all connected. Actually, when they made that album, John Lennon and Paul McCartney had an argument about it. John wanted to do individual songs, and Paul wanted to do just a long album that with all the songs connected, with that orchestral idea. And they agreed to compromise, and so the first side of the album, in that days, of course, the LPs got two sides. I guess we still have LPs now, and they're coming back. Maybe you have some. But the first side of the LP was separate songs, and then you flipped it over. It does start with Here Comes the Sun, which is separate, but beyond that, the rest of the songs are all connected till the end of the album. And that was something that was typical in progressive rock groups, too. They had longer songs where they could take up the whole side of an album. Now, that wouldn't really work, of course, on top 40 music stations that were limiting the amount of time that these songs could play. But fortunately, at the time, there was FM radio. And so a lot of these groups were heard on FM radio stations. And they did have hits. Some of the groups had certainly hits on top 40 as well. But you could really hear their music if you had access to one of those stations that played that kind of music. And we did, because WLAV-FM at the time in Grand Rapids used to play a lot of progressive rock. It was a very interesting radio station at the time. I spent a lot of time listening to WLAV-FM in those days, where we heard a lot of progressive rock groups, the psychedelic rock. I mean, they play whole sides of Jimi Hendrix albums and whole sides of Yes albums, and it was they could do that then. Now they did change their format. I mean, now it is classic rock, but I don't think they do that as much as they used to. Now, so these groups, the progressive rock groups, they were virtuosic musicians often, really fantastic players, super groups in some respects, I would say. They were influenced by not only rock, blues, but classical music, jazz, various folk music, world music, synthesizers, and they would experiment with other instruments too, just as the Beatles and the Rolling Stones had added instruments that were not usually heard in rock music. And the songs were often very long. Some of these bands you've probably heard of. I'll just name a few: King Crimson, the Moody Blues, Pink Floyd, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Genesis, Jethro Tull. Later, Rush, and then Dream Theater is considered in this genre too. One of my favorite bands of the day was Yes. And so if you haven't heard them, I'll put a link on there for a song. I'll put a link on to Roundabouts so you can listen to that. A song by Yes. It's the band. Okay, so send me some information this week as well about this, what you heard in this video, along with the information about what you might have learned in the Country Music Timeline. All right, thanks everybody, and have a great week. Be well.